Hello, everyone. I'm Theo Ransaw. I work at the University of one of the best and most premier, but more importantly, one of the more exciting universities in the United States, Michigan State University, and I work in the College of Education. And what I like about Michigan State University is that we have amazing opportunities to connect with folks all across the globe, all around the world, and all across the United States. So with that in mind, we're going to talk just a little bit about student agency, right? And the premise behind the book is a wonderful gentleman I met about a year and a half ago, Anindya Kundu. We had written together and worked together, had a few emails, and he contributed a chapter on the handbook of, excuse me, make sure I get this, he contributed a chapter on the handbook of research on Black. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, it's a little
okay,
choppy.
I'm sorry.
I hear you.
Okay, I apologize. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, let me start over again. He contributed a chapter on the handbook of research on Black males, talked about grit, and his chapter that he submitted, I was astonished to see that he was still a doc student. So he's worked under Pedro Nagaro, and that's a world famous researcher that deals with Black males and also with regards to student agency and student engagement. He's also worked with another woman that's been amazing, Angela Duckworth. She's done a lot of research about grit, and his chapter on grit has allowed him to have a really immersive background with student agency, grit, and justice reform. So I was amazed by him, and I couldn't believe he was just a doc student. Now he's not a doc student. Now he's got his PhD, and he's making moves around the world. And you may have heard he has a book called The Power of Student Agency, Looking Beyond Grit to Close the Opportunity Gap. And we're going to talk a little bit about him, his book, and we have some other amazing contributors that will be helping us along today. We have Tammy Darling. We also have Paul Gorski, and we'll be having conversations with them as we go along. So we'll start in just a second. We have one question starting off with Tammy. If you don't mind, talk just a little bit about yourself for a couple of seconds, if you don't mind.
Sure. So in 2017, after watching Anindya's very first talk, I just was so appreciative of the authentic way he unpacked opportunity. And it was right when the TED Talks had moved into like the reading list, including it. And I was just really curious about Roses in Concrete, and I reached out by email because I couldn't open the PDF. And that started, I mean, I just am so appreciative that this has come around full circle because when I was applying to a doctoral program, Anindya was very supportive and helpful in that process as well. So I'm super excited to be here.
And if I may just cut in, you guys got to introduce yourself. This is a stellar all-star panel. So when the mic's yours, please introduce yourself. So Tammy, give us your background.
Sure. So I've been a public high school social studies educator for 24 years. I've taught class, race, and gender and psychology electives, and I have always lived in Massachusetts. And I've just started a doctoral program myself in education at Northeastern University.
Hey.
Fantastic. Paul, tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you came to be associated with student agency.
Sure. So I guess not really. So I've had a bunch of different roles in education from all related to educational equity, and most recently being a teacher educator, and then running social justice and human rights undergrad and grad programs. And I now run the Equity Literacy Institute, which is an organization that basically, well, used to travel around the country, leading professional development and other kinds of consulting work directly with schools and school districts around equity and justice. And I would say my connection is maybe a little indirect. A lot of my scholarship and my writing has to do with things that are important to kind of frame student agency and that sort of thing, like deficit ideology and the ways that the voices of students who are marginalized in various ways get undercut, even in the context of quote unquote equity and justice work in schools. So I think that's sort of my connection.
And where are you calling from today?
Asheville, North Carolina.
North Carolina. Wow, there's some really amazing agency going on in North Carolina. Maybe we'll get to talking about that a little bit later. And what would you like to share with us? And I don't know where you're from. I know we've talked for a few moments, but I don't know where you're calling from.
Sure. So I'm in New York. It's been about 10 years that I've lived in New York. I never would have thought that was going to be the case, having grown up in Portland, Oregon, done college in Chicago, and then ended up in New York. The last decade plus of my life really has been revolving around education and educational equity. In Chicago, one of my first work experiences was working at a research project at the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. And that experience really showed me the class and racial divide related to youth justice and equity, because all of the kids coming into the detention center were Black and brown from the same south and west sides of Chicago, from the same zip codes. And recidivism was about 95%. And that experience is what brought me to want to study education as a preventative resource and tool for community building. I've spent some time in the Department of Education working around Common Core rollout, but also realized through that how strapped schools and districts really are to implement broad sweeping changes, and how sometimes the most marginalized can end up get even further left behind. Through my doctoral studies, as you mentioned, worked with Angela Duckworth and Pedro Noguera to expand the idea of grit to actually have social context, because when grit was the word of the day, it was broadly being applied to school contexts. And without the nuance, that could almost be dangerous, because we're implying that kids have enough resources at their disposal to just tap into their effort and take advantage of the American opportunity system. That is not the case, as I think most of us would agree. We're really understanding that education can actually, the way in which school systems are set up right now, can perpetuate the social divide. And so that's kind of what my book and work is about. Right now, I'm a senior fellow at the City University of New York Grad Center, and I'm doing education and workforce development research at LMIS. And we work with communities to think about research to practice to help build up the resources that individuals can use, and think about pathways to opportunity. So including education, higher education, and workforce development all together. And so I think all of those conversations kind of go hand in hand when we think about justice and equity. And so I'm really excited to learn more with you all today.
Well, I think I've learned a lot already just from these introductions. Well, just to ground the conversation, I am from Southside Chicago, and Cook, I'm very well familiar with that. A lot of the things that you've heard about on television regarding Chicago and things going on, that's where I'm from. That's my neighborhood, Southside Chicago, Morgan Park. And so one of the things that was going along when I was born, there's this thing folks may have heard of called the school to prison pipeline, right? And also students being pushed out and expelled. There's also a little bit of conversation about how school to prison pipeline schools directly influence people being incarcerated, particularly folks of color being incarcerated. But there's also conversations about housing. There's also conversations about unemployment. Also conversations about predatory lending, all in those around the world, and also things with regards to how there are obstacles or barriers to folks, but specifically with regards to young folks and being able to access education and better opportunities and better life outcomes. I think the phrase of the day is living your best life. So with regards to living your best life, sometimes all students aren't involved in a conversation with regards to living their best life, education, job, employment. So starting off with Tammy, in what ways do we encourage or discourage dialogue that invites all students on the fullness of their background story, and what questions and considerations can we offer young adults to invigorate them to get on their own to help them live their best life?
Sure. It's a great question. A connection that I made, just recently, Kelly McGonigal authored this book, The Joy of Movement, and chapter 5 is titled Overcoming Obstacles. And there's this quote that really made me think about this work around agency that goes like this. Once you've sensed yourself as powerful, it changes the way you look at obstacles. And so I think that there are ways as educators in our classrooms that we can facilitate these opportunities for all of our students to feel powerful. And so, we have to get bold and imaginative about what student voice looks like in our classroom. And so I think we encourage, this power and this, ownership of the fullness of our stories, not just these linear paths, by really broadening our curricula questions and imbuing them with like purpose and meaning, and asking these reflective questions to our students about how they see themselves in these different narratives. And I think we discourage, the ownership of the fullness of the stories, as educators, and also, other privileged peers who ask these questions of appraisal, that they're asking these questions that are almost kind of sizing up, because I think in the classroom, a lot of things, homework and presentations and projects in particular, they're filters for privilege. So things that we, kind of presume that maybe all students have the opportunities or skills or dispositions for, sometimes inadvertently amplifies things that are really kind of closely tied to privileges and opportunities that are kind of built sometimes outside of the classroom. So I think that, figuring out ways to invite student voices through different means of presentations, as opposed to having students maybe always come up to the front of the class. I'll never forget a student a few years ago during a group presentation was not even facing her peers, was facing the whiteboard. Peers were facing, their other peers. And I think that there's kind of this dynamic that sometimes is amplified through these presumptions about these skills and dispositions that sometimes happen in these different extracurricular activities or summer programs that amplify differences. So I think, journaling, circle discussions, small group conversations that allow for that real reflective piece of who I am through the work, I think can be really successful, make students kind of help students experience those powerful experiences.
Can I just jump in on that? I'd love to add something that connects what Tammy just said to Paul's work. I came across Dr. Gorski's work because I'm also motivated to help combat these deficit perspectives that are so implicit in education, kind of this idea that not those kids. Rather, we should be thinking, how can our educational system be such that all students are able to demonstrate competency, but also different giftednesses that they have. And so, through Dr. Gorski's work, I started to also use this phrase, hidden forms of giftedness. That is a form of cultural competency, giving students a platform to demonstrate their true gifts and interests. That's how we can motivate them to, tap into other academics. And so I love what you're saying about, question asking. It's a form of power, whose questions are we, prioritizing. I think in this moment in time, in the COVID context, we have to treat our students like the experts that they are. As adults are kind of racking their brains and pulling their hairs out, thinking about what is school going to look like in the fall. what if we were to ask, the children what kind of education they would like to see? What we're finally, grappling with this opportunity that education may not necessarily just have to look like the teacher as the jug and all the students as the mug, because now we have the opportunity to realize that the world can be a student's classroom. Just one last thing I'll say is one of the participants in my book, he was tracked into special education. He came from a broken home up until 10th grade. He really had a disdain for school, and he had IEPs throughout his education. And it wasn't until 10th grade in an English class when his teacher realized, like similar to the student Tammy just mentioned, he would sit in the back of his class, scribble away furiously at a notebook, and seldom ever look up when the teacher was talking. So she took it upon herself to ask him what he was writing, and saw pages and pages full of beautiful rap lyrics demonstrating that he, had very strong grasp of literacy. And so she used that as a motivational tool to him and allowed him to, record a CD through a recording studio connection she had. And the student got to perform a song in his class, and he got a standing ovation from his classmates. And that became one of the most formative memories of his life. And that helped him detrack from the track he was on. And today he's an incredibly successful person who works in finance. And those little moments where we give students the power to demonstrate who they are, I think can be life-changing.
So I'm hearing, helping students with affirmation and building on their strengths. So you talked just a little bit about the school to prison pipeline. And so what you've been sharing is that the school to prison pipeline can be disruptive, that you can have a detour, right? And there's some off-roads that you can get off into. So Dr. Gorski, can you tell us a little bit about what detours look like with regards to racial equity? And I think you've had some conferences and kind of push on and extend from what Tammy Darling was talking about just a few months ago.
Yeah, one thing I'd love to just add to the previous conversation really quickly is I think one of the hard things about talking about student agency is that if we're really going to talk about, we have to talk about the structural things that also, like we talk about student agency, and then we have this obsession with emotion regulation that polices students, reasonable responses to the things that they're experiencing. Schools are not structured to schools, and especially today, there's just this whole cycle of things that in a way look like they're being responsive to students, but are often weaponized in ways that silence students. And, I think all the social emotional stuff can end up being that way if it's not applied thoughtfully. And all the talk about emotion regulation, I think what's really happening is sort of the opposite of what we're talking about, where there's all kinds, it's really interesting because one of the things I do with schools, some of the work that my organization does, we do these equity assessments. And for those, we often do analyze like student policy handbooks, and what's interesting about those is at the beginning of them, there's always something about how much we value diversity and how much we value individualism and that sort of thing. And then the rest of the document is policing expression out of students, or certain kinds of expression. Like if my agency is naming the racism that I'm experiencing from you, that is, I don't mean you, anyone on the panel, I just mean in general, then that's really sort of policed and punished. So most students who experience racism in schools never name it to anyone with authority in the school because of how they'll be punished for doing so. This connects to racial equity detours, I think, partially because in a lot of schools, I think the conversations about equity have started to revolve around notions like grit and growth mindset and these popular programs and initiatives that, again, I think are often weaponized against, you know, and wealthy schools that are predominantly white, nobody's talking about grit and nobody's talking about growth mindset. That does not, those conversations aren't happening in those schools the ways they're happening in high poverty schools with a lot of students of color. And it's like we've reached the point in education, or maybe it's not a new thing, it actually isn't a new thing, but where we identify a problem like racial outcome gaps. And instead of responding to those, the only way that's going to fix them, which is anti-racism, eliminating racism, racist policies and practices, we just go through these popular initiatives and, well, let's throw grit at that and see if that helps. Let's throw trauma-informed at that and see if that helps. It's like everything we do is kind of detouring around the central issue of you know, racial justice. And unfortunately, I think about 75% of the work in schools that is called equity work has no shot at creating more equity. And I think in essence, that's by design, because what gets rewarded isn't equity in a school. What gets rewarded is the illusion of equity. So, oh, well, look, we have this trauma-informed program, so we'll celebrate that. That's how I think sort of the equity stuff overlaps with what we're talking about.
Wow, that was a very vivid perspective of what's going on in the schools that I've seen, you know, over here as well. Tammy, did you want to respond?
Well, as Paul was talking, it was really interesting. You know, I was just kind of thinking about some of the conversations I've been invited, you know, through professional development. And I think, I feel like change is disorienting to teachers, right? And it causes lots of disequilibrium. And I feel like the vulnerability and the honesty is not something that most educators are schooled in. You know, I think just the opposite, actually. I think, you know, we are, you know, asked to be content experts and to, you know, be sure that we have, you know, these really tight instructional plans. But until we're able to lean in and invest in the potentiality of all students, and to really kind of, I guess, really kind of push against these cultural specific lenses that we use to view student behavior, we're going to continually, you know, go for these expansive, expensive interventions that are still not getting at the stories that young people are coming into the classrooms with about who they are. And I think it's really tied up in the limited amount of information that we get about students, even in a school database. What do you have? An address and a grade report? You know, what about a big question like, you know, or a strength that's generated by a student that we could access, you know, because I feel like a lot of misunderstandings come from, like, you know, typically some issues, you know, that tend to bubble up around, you know, initial compliancy, right? Schools are not controlling bodies. They're supposed to be awakening minds. And so I feel like there's different ways to bring us all into this space of vulnerability to really consider what are the optics in your classroom? What's the messaging that we are co-developers of this learning, right? That I think about just the language of SWABOT, right? Students will be able to, like, on the agenda. Why don't we just, like, get that out of there and say, let's consider.
Oh, yes.
You know, let's consider, like, here is what we're going to consider today. You know, as I've been teaching for a while, and it's so interesting that I'm very rarely in a kind of a front and center space in my classroom. Like, you never know where I am. I'm always on the periphery, and I'm like down, you know, trying to communicate these cues of, you're important, you know, your place in this classroom is important. I see you, I hear you. And so I think that they're, you know, operationalizing how we are inviting all students into our space and have value. I think that there's got to be a way to engage in this a little bit differently. I don't know if that was, sorry, that might have been tangential, circular, all over.
You know, I think you kind of answered it and gave us more. I'm going to personally say to hurry up and get your PhD, because we need more of you. We need more. We need you to have more time so you can have more ideas to share. So I appreciate you that. So we talked about agency. We talked about grit. We talked about detour. We talked about personalizing experience between teachers and students. And then I mentioned a little bit earlier about the detours and maybe off ramps. So here in Michigan, automotive is a pretty big deal, car industries and how that's played a role in economics, but also with regards to detours and off-road and driving our students and having them roadmaps, you know, for achievement. Another really interesting term that's really popular here in Michigan is grit, right? So you may have heard of a city called Detroit. Grit is really important because that has a lot to do with disenfranchisement, being, you know, excluded, but still being tough and getting through it. So there's a lot of t-shirts that says Detroit against everybody else, right? Having grit and fortitude and being able to succeed. So with regards to grit and how that plays a role into agency, Anindya, can you tell us a little bit about how grit and student agency plays a role in helping to close opportunity gaps and bring the best force from all the children that we have, all the students that we work with? What can you tell us about that?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So, you know, anyone kind of involved in education knows how widely sweeping the term grit has been applied over the last few years. You know, KIPP charter schools have made it one of their core values, and as you see it as a city's motto or sports team's motto. And the issue with that is that it has been so sweepingly applied that it has just meant tenacity and effort. Originally, Dr. Angela Duckworth, her concept of grit is this idea that you know, everybody has this North Star possibly in their world that guides their day-to-day activities. So they're still thinking about this long-term goal, but they're putting in the day-in, day-out hard work. I think it's a good concept. It's been validated through a lot of research. But the issue with grit is that that doesn't lack a social context specificity. As Paul was mentioning, education is really also about structures. You know, where a kid grows up, their zip code that they come from, their parents' level of education, those actually are more determining factors of how far a student will go in education or the income that they can expect to achieve. And so when we're talking about just grit, we're kind of leaving out those structural considerations. You know, today we're talking about educational justice. To me, educational justice is this idea that all children should be deserving of a quality education. I think that idea is why we get into this work to do research, why teachers get into teaching, is because in America, we really have this, you know, idea that we have egalitarian values and visions, and that our schools provide the opportunity to level the playing field. The actual reality is that given the structures that schools are placed in, sometimes they can perpetuate inequality. Schools, through no fault of their own, can be complicit in the inequality process. So what we really need is to think about community-minded solutions, structural solutions. You know, sometimes teachers, I'm sure Tammy could, you know, attest to this, in poor schools have to dig into their own pockets to pay for supplies. That's only furthering a problem. In my own research, I've seen students who have come to class hungry, and a teacher has noticed that rather than saying, oh, because they're hungry, they're fidgety, and therefore they're not paying attention, the teacher has actually noticed that and shared their lunch with the student. It shouldn't have to be that way. What we really need is more holistic, social-minded solutions. And so I say all of that to say that that's where this idea of agency comes from, because agency it predicates the need to understand the social context. In sociology, agency is a foundational concept. We're asking how much influence do people have over their own lives? Is it the amount of free will that people have, or is it the structural forces in their life that is more determining? And so agency, by definition, implies the existence of structures. We have to think about what are the workarounds that people have, even if they have structural obstacles in their life. And so in my book, I define agency as a person's capacity to leverage resources to navigate obstacles and create positive changes in their life. And those resources are also social, being able to ask for help. As Paul mentioned, in privileged schools, those are parts of the hidden curriculum. Students know that they can talk to adults like their peers and ask for help. But in other schools, that's not necessarily taught. So social supports, how can students learn help-seeking behavior? How can they learn to network and build their own networks? And also cultural supports is a part of agency. Again, acknowledging that there are hidden forms of giftedness, cultural capital, and also having mentors who can kind of instill within you a sense of, respect for your background. Schools that foster a sense of racial pride. In my book, I profile Medgar Evers College Prep and James Baldwin High School transfer school, and they're both Title I schools where all students qualify for free and reduced lunch, but they do a lot of other things that don't require the district to support them. They build racial pride through these names of these iconic Black civil rights leaders. They showcase student work in the halls. They kind of push the limits with the classes they can offer. James Baldwin offers a class called Dracula and Gender Identity. And so teachers are excited to teach these classes. Students
Everybody likes Dracula.
Yeah, and there is some gender identity stuff going on there. I wish I had taken that growing up. But it gets students excited about learning, and it also acknowledges the backgrounds and challenges that they have. And so that's kind of how agency can address the opportunity gap by precisely that, like understanding that the achievement gap is actually an opportunity gap, and then thinking about the specific supports that students need. So, just really trying to bring humanity back into the classroom, understanding your students as individuals to then understand the potential that they have. And so, as Paul also mentioned and Tammy mentioned, sometimes we sweepingly go to apply a policy because it's, the hot topic of the day, without attention to the community that the school is in, or the families that the school is serving, or the specific students. And so we have to think about that individuality aspect to really come up with better tailored solutions.
Wow. So with regards to equity and student agency, Paul, where do we go from here?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is I think the structural piece needs to come first. There's no amount of student agency that is going to overcome a system that is rife with oppression. And so I think we need to be very careful to not put the responsibility back on students, even if we're putting part of the responsibility on adults to cultivate this in students. In the end, this comes down to the responsibility of students. And I get really nervous when conversations sound like, how do we prepare students to navigate the oppressive conditions in schools? And there's not a conversation about how are the adults going to eliminate the oppressive conditions in schools. So I think that's the first, I think that's the first thing. I mean, if a student's sort of energy around agency is going into, and first of all, the students who are the most marginalized students in that sense already have the most sort of agency, if you look at inward looking agency, because think about, I'm experiencing structural racism, maybe I'm experiencing poverty, maybe I don't have health care, maybe my parents are experiencing employment discrimination, and somehow by some miracle of resilience, I am here and I am showing up to school. And for some reason, that's not defined as grit. Those are the kids white teachers look at it and say, wow, that kid really needs more grit. And that's what I get really nervous about. So I think it's putting the structural piece first, the structural context first, and just making sure we're not slipping into any form of a conversation that suggests that we're going to eliminate outcome disparities or the opportunity gap by adjusting anything in the people who are being oppressed, when the oppression is the thing that is creating the gap. The unfair distribution of access and opportunity. So to me, the first step is really an ideological step. What I just described is an ideological gap, and most schools are really failing at that ideological gap. So they'll talk about grit and growth mindset and SEL and everything else. And it's come to light even a lot more now because you have all these schools and principals and superintendents who have written these public letters saying, oh, we're totally against racism and we stand with Black people in our community. And it's like they're against racism everywhere except for their own school. None of them are listing, here's how we're getting rid of the racist teachers in our school. Here's how we're going to transform the curriculum in our school. Here's how we're going to stop talking about grit and start talking about racial justice in our school. And so, I think it's like that ideological shift needs to happen. This sort of going away with, we have to adjust something about the kids. And I mean, it's a both and really, not an either or. The problem is it's not being operationalized as a both and. It's being operationalized as, here's what we can adjust about students so that we don't have to adjust this oppressive system. So I think the first thing is to flip that and say, we're going to adjust the system, and through giving students access to a more just and welcoming and inclusive system, that's what's going to cultivate the agency.
Well, so I'm hearing helping students to, I guess a better way to say it is, we're looking at where we're going to go from here is not making students responsible for solving all the issues and problems that they didn't create, right? And making sure we change our framework, right? And having a better way of understanding is a good way to go. Tammy, what are your thoughts about where do we go from here with regards to student agency? And we'll let Anindya finish up.
Yeah, I think that, we need to build in critical pedagogy. I think that we need to talk about human malleability. I think we need to talk about story editing. I think we need more from our students than just what they do in academic work. Like I think we need to tap into that for sure.
Perfect. I like that. And the floor is yours. Why don't you take us home, so to speak?
Yeah, I'll probably leave a couple minutes too for other remarks. On the idea of ideology, it's interesting that, one way to think about ideology, just so we can understand how it works, is that it operates at the level of common sense. So when Paul's saying we should, work on the ideology first, I wholeheartly agree. And the reason that that's hard is because so much of this exists at almost like this invisible level of common sense. Only up until a few years ago were we questioning the idea that maybe America isn't a meritocratic society. Like, excuse my language, but no crap, it's not, where a student grows up is based on their neighborhood, is based on their race, and is based on their class, and all of that has been designed. And so many years later, we've forgotten that because it's a part of the ideology. Best and the brightest make it. We have the opportunity. Every student gets to go to public school, whether or not they're undocumented or homeless. And we think just by association of that access that it's equal. It's anything but equal. And in fact, it can further inequality. So I think conversations like this are incredibly important. Cross-pollination of ideas, of people, of researchers and practitioners to get at this ideology, because we need to consistently shine a light on it. And, in this moment is particularly powerful in our history. We're reckoning with two pandemics. We have the one that, causes us to cover our face when we go outside, but then we have the other one that shows up every once in a while, but it's been around since the foundation of America, and that's largely structural racism. And so we have this opportunity now to have these conversations, and also to invite our young people to kind of lead those conversations, because they will be the ones impacting the policies of the future. So, Black Lives Matter has come back to the forefront of our society, which is wonderful, but it had started 4 years ago, and I read about this in my book. And somehow we didn't keep the momentum going. So how do we keep the momentum going this time to avoid further racial disparities? And I think we invite our students to partake in these conversations and understand that these are teachable moments for all of us. And so I think, agency is important, but the structure has to come first. We have to think about what we can do about these structural forces. And, working together to build community-minded solutions will hopefully help foster student agency.
Wow, that's really deep. Well, we're wrapping things up based on our time. Who has some concluding or closing remarks they'd like to share?
I feel like there's some really great frameworks out there to build into, interdisciplinary work. And one that I, really appreciated because it really gets at the big question that we should be asking young people, which is what matters to you and why? And so I know that the Democratic Knowledge Project has the 10 questions for change makers, right? These youth-led participatory action research projects. I feel like, that's where that power and voice, moving judiciously from, thinking about what matters to moving from the I to the we. I think that can be really empowering and really, I think get kids into kind of this like purpose development mode to utilize and actualize those skills and dispositions we hope we impart.
One thing I'll say just to kind of, because I feel like I've been maybe avoiding the conversation directly about student agency. One thing I would like to see is, in a lot of schools that I've worked with, there are like these student clubs and student organizations based around different identities of students who are marginalized in various ways. And often I think the mentorship they get is a kind of mentorship that guides them toward doing kind of fluffy things. Like we're gonna host a dance, or we're gonna host an international food fair, or or something like that. There's not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think it's an underestimation of what youth are capable of doing. And when students are expressing an interest in these sorts of issues, to be able to connect those interests to things that are happening in the wider society, and to have them thinking not just in terms of what can we change in the school, but how do we address racism or transphobia or whatever it is in society. And that means we need adults in school who can mentor kids in that way, and who can do that without being punished by leadership or by colleagues for doing that. I think we often underestimate what students are capable of and what they're ready for in these conversations. And that's one of the ways that we block agency. Just really quickly, research shows that by age 2, children of color are already recognizing race. They're already observing people in their family experiencing racism. They're already noticing racial bias by age 2. They might not have that language, but they're noticing it. But we still have kindergarten teachers who are saying, well, my students aren't ready for that conversation, so we're going to have the diversity art fair instead. And when they say the kids aren't ready for that, what they're really saying is, I feel like I need to protect white kids from the truth. And that harms the agency of white kids just as much as it harms the agency of kids of color. So I think in terms of I've been talking more ideologically, in terms of a more practical thing, I think that's a place to address some of these issues.
So the power of student agency and looking beyond grit to close the opportunity gap. I think it's been an amazing discussion, and I think next steps will be have closing comments from our author, and what closing remarks do you have? I can't think of anything else to add. I think this conversation has been excellent, and my mind has been growing and exploding with all these great ideas and the potential for possibilities. But I think we can have a really good recap and tell us the next steps forward.
Sure. Thanks, Ted. Just want to quickly thank you all for making the time today. It's been so lovely to connect and have these conversations. Each of your work has inspired me, and so I'm really happy to be able to come together. And the book actually launches today, so thank you for joining me and celebrating that. I would just say, all of this is making education more equitable. And what that means is that we can't box students into preconceived notions of what we think they should be and what success should look like. We should allow them to reframe our mindsets on these kinds of topics. And so always having a broader idea of what student competency looks like and what does mastery look like, I think is at the forefront of this. Allow students to drive those conversations. That's how you get to personalized learning, for them to make the learning personalized to them and show the different ways in which they've mastered or excel at something. Be open to that, because the future, we have no idea what kind of jobs there are going to be that people are going to need to fulfill. So what we really need is our students to become the individuals who they, are meant to be, and not get in their way, but, help them get on that path. And so I think conversations like this are incredibly important, and we should listen to our young people too. And then, we'll hopefully be in a better place for the future. So that's what I got to close with. And thank you all again. Really appreciate it.
Listening to young people, student agency. Great way to finish up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Great.
Congrats on the book.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Available on Amazon.com. Don't forget to pick it up.
Appreciate it, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Take care.